Mr. Thomas, this is Joanna. I thought I'd check the volume and see that you can hear me. I can't hear you, just FYI.
I had you on mute. I apologize.
That's okay.
And
just wanted to check and make sure I can be heard, first of all.
Yeah, let me see if I can get. Okay. Okay. Hang on just a moment, please.
They don't want you to fall and stay down. There you go, sir.
Okay.
Here, I go on. Oh,
You hear me now?
I can hear you. I just to make you go ahead. Go ahead.
Trying to get. I'm going to have to. The speaker on my room's setting. Hang on just a moment here. We also have, I want to introduce you to my colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
They're both on mute, but we have Mrs. McGuire and CJ Holston.
Okay.
Yeah, hang on.
Are those the only other two that I should expect to join us?
One more.
Okay.
Call right next door. Are you on? Okay, I'd like you and Holston to work this out. If you can't get this up in the near future, would it be possible for them? I don't know how many you have to go over to Holston. Okay, but we need to, yeah, thanks. Bye-bye. Okay, dealing with, yeah, so we're good to go. And Mrs. McGuire's, Holston is helping with my other colleague. And would you say something?
Sure. 1, 2, 3.
Got it.
Perfect. Well,
Okay.
Mr. Thomas, when you say go, we'll start. I'll turn my camera on and we'll get started.
Okay. I'll just let you know if we could abbreviate it, or we'll stop where we are when we have to stop.
I've got the quickie version, so that's fine. I can make that happen.
Good. I understand this is being recorded.
It is, and that way, if you had any students that missed the presentation, I'll send you the recording with the passcode, and students will be able to access it.
I think that'll be great. And I see Miss Pierce is coming up, so it looks like we have a full house.
Okay.
Would you like to, at this time, would you care to, well, how about I'll introduce you.
All right, I'm going to turn my camera on. Go ahead.
Okay, students. This person is Mrs. Hahn, and she is correct me if I'm wrong, the regional director of State Historic Sites. And
That's correct.
so she oversees the Levi and Catherine Coffin House State Historic Site, which we're going to see. What are the other ones? All of the rest of them are just in this region?
I just have, yeah, so my region is what's called the Central Region. So besides the Coffin site, that includes the Whitewater Canal State Historic Site in Metamora, about an hour south of where I am, and the TC Still home and studio in Brent. But there are
Awesome.
eight other additional historic sites in the state of Indiana that are part of our museum system.
Yeah, very good. On very short notice, Ms. Hahn agreed to provide this great opportunity. And without further ado, please give your undivided attention and learn a lot about this site, please.
Okay.
It's all yours.
Well, thanks for your time this afternoon. Just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm standing. If you saw the picture of the red brick home earlier, before I turned my camera on, that's the home I'm standing in. I mentioned I'm in Fountain City, Indiana, about 10 minutes north of Richmond. I like to tell folks from Indianapolis, you go east out of Indianapolis and I-70 and you turn left right before you hit the Ohio state line and you're in Fountain City. So, so hopefully with what you're going to see today, I'll just let you know, we may not have time for questions at the end, but Mr. Thomas knows how to get a hold of me. So if there's interest and want to ask questions and want some follow-up, he can send me those questions and I'll be happy to do that. Now, what we're going to do, I'm going to flip my camera around because we're going to be walking through the house. I'm going to be giving some stories. This is a house that was built in 1839. And I'm going to be connecting a few stories that we know of Levi and Catherine Coffin. And you're going to be seeing these rooms where some of these stories took place. The Coffins are connected to some of the best evidenced stories connected to the Underground Railroad in Indiana. The house I'm standing in was known as the Grand Central Station for the Underground Railroad. And the Coffins lived here from 1839 to 1847. So they didn't live in the house for very long. They intended to spend the rest of their lives here. That didn't happen. They'll move to Cincinnati in 1847. But they actually called Fountain City home starting in 1826 when they moved here from North Carolina. Now, Levi Coffin was a businessman here in town. He owned a dry goods store. He invested in several other businesses. And with the success of those businesses, he was able to use the resources he was able to acquire to potentially impact the lives of up to 2,000 freedom seekers or runaway slaves during the 20-year period they called Fountain City home. So this house was built 13 years after they had come here. It's a brick home, probably the first brick home that was built within the community. This is a picture of Levi Coffin. If you Google Underground Railroad in Indiana, this is the picture that's going to come up. So Levi is sort of seen as I said, because of the stories we have and the evidence that we have of connecting the home and his work with the Underground Railroad. This is his wife, Catherine. These are the pictures that normally show up when you Google that. Now, Levi and Catherine spent 40 years of their marriage committed to helping to end slavery within the United States. And though Coffin himself would call himself an abolitionist, he wasn't a typical abolitionist such as like a Frederick Douglass, where he's making speeches, or someone like William Lloyd Garrison, or someone who was running a newspaper. He didn't necessarily write, he didn't speak. I kind of see him more as like a grassroots organizer, where he has access to certain resources and he's supporting people who are those speakers, those abolitionists, those people who are speaking out against slavery, especially during the 1840s when he was living here in the house. What you see here is another portrait of Levi. So when Levi talks about his role as an abolitionist, and he goes into some of the relationships he had with individuals who are more well known in this period for history, like Frederick Douglass, he mentions that when they came and visited here in Fountain City, they would make a point to stop and visit with him. We know that Frederick Douglass was here on a visit in 1843 when he made his first trip to Indiana. We're not quite sure what parts of the house he visited in. It may have been in this particular room, which we call the library. And as you can see, we actually have it set up with beds. We think from time to time it was used as a guest bedroom. when other individuals and abolitionists stayed here. But this may have been a room where they hosted Frederick Douglass. What did they talk about? Levi Coffin didn't leave us any evidence, or Douglass, of what their discussions were about. But this was Douglass's first journey to Indiana, which was not a very welcoming visit for him. He did a speech in Richmond, he did a speech in Pendleton, Indiana, and in both locations he was attacked. But when he came later in the 1850s and even in the 1880s and spoke here in Wayne County, he was more warmly receptive, or they were more warmly receptive to the messages he had to give at that time. Now, to understand the Underground Railroad, and this may be a little bit of review if you've covered this in your classroom or you've been doing some reading on this, the Underground Railroad really forms as a resistance movement in the 1800s during a period where fugitive slave laws dictated that if an enslaved African escaped from slavery, no matter where they escaped to, even if they escaped to a free state like Indiana, they're still enslaved. You don't just earn freedom because you make it to a free state. And there were individuals who felt it was wrong, slavery was wrong. They either do so for moral or religious reasons. The Coffins themselves were Quakers, members of a group called the Society of Friends, who were very vocal and very active in fighting slavery. And not all Americans felt that slavery was wrong. There were more Americans in this period of history that felt slavery. If Kentucky wanted to be a slave state, that was their business. That was kind of the opinion of that day. States could choose whether or not to be free or slave. So when the Coffins came here in the 1820s, there's already the beginning of a movement, as we can see in Levi's stories, especially in helping freedom seekers try to escape slavery. And the thought at the time was to make it to free states like Indiana or Ohio. By the time we get to the 1840s, the Underground Railroad is becoming more of a coordinated effort. This is another portrait of Levi that I'm showing you. So when Levi came here in 1826, he and his wife Catherine thought they had left slavery behind in North Carolina. Levi actually had been involved in aiding slaves escaping out of North Carolina, getting to places like Indiana. But by the 1830s and into the 1840s, it is being recommended by many who are trying to aid those people to escape to actually continue further north into Canada, because the laws in certain states like Indiana are being passed, making it very difficult for people of color to live without, at any point in Indiana, a person of color could be questioned whether they were free or slave, which is very difficult to prove. Even if you were born a free Black, you didn't have a birth certificate, you didn't have a social security card, you didn't have anything that said for sure who you were and that you were a free person. So if a freedom seeker would make it to a free state like Indiana, and if they were questioned, even if they lived here for years, they wouldn't be able to prove whether they were free. And so Canada becomes extremely attractive by the 1830s for many of these individuals who are trying to help these individuals get further north. And it took an amazing amount of coordination to do this. And in this particular space, which we call the sitting room here in the house, we know that the Coffins had anti-slavery meetings. Coffin says they called them library meetings in his memoir that he wrote, because they were trying to keep people who were against what they were working towards from figuring out what they were doing. They had to be very careful. Coffin was a little more open in the public about what he was doing and supporting, but he knew some of his neighbors may not be as open or willing to possibly help and participate and didn't want to be as public. So they called them library meetings to try to keep people from making certain accusations or even attacking them, which was a possibility. Something else that happened here, speaking a little bit to the women in our community, we're not talking about just men and involvement in this. Women were very instrumental to the Underground Railroad. And here in Fountain City, much of what the women were supporting and doing was through a sewing circle that was hosted in this space that Levi's wife, Catherine, would manage. So many enslaved individuals escaped, especially in the winter months, which is not the most easy or most comfortable time of the year to do that. And coming further north, Levi says many arrived with just rags for clothes. They never had shoes. And so the sewing circles would form so that new clothing, blankets, those kinds of things could be created and given so that before Coffin or someone else here in town would help them further up north on the railroad, which we'll talk a little more about what that looks like here in a second, they would have new clothing. They'd be able to keep them safer and warmer for that further journey. And so that was some of the activities that happened in this particular space. So when you think about what does it take to help an individual, what does it take to accomplish what you can, the Coffins normally only had about a day or two with most of the freedom seekers that spent time under the roof here in this particular house. In this room that I have just walked into, which we call the dining kitchen space of the house, it's in the back wing. This is really the first room, the first space of contact most freedom seekers had with the Coffins. Now, sometimes we get questions of how would a freedom seeker know where the Coffins lived? How would they know that they're safe, that they can trust them? There is a lot of risk, even in trying to trust an individual that you think may be part of the Underground Railroad. How can you be sure? But if you're able to, south of here, find someone who is part of that effort, it's up to that individual to find someone that lives north of them that they know that they can trust. One individual we know the Coffins worked a lot with was another Quaker from Union County, which is south of here, named William Beard. And his house still stands. It's a private home. Someone still lives there. But if we were to get on a bus and drive from the Coffin home to the Beard home, we'd be there in about 30 minutes. But that's almost a whole night's travel, if not a day's travel, depending on the condition of the roads. But Beard knew Coffin well. He knew Coffin could be trusted. And so the freedom seekers he helped in his home were brought here next. And then Coffin would figure out who he can trust north of here to take those individuals further north. So oftentimes when freedom seekers arrived, this is happening under or in the darkness, in the time of night. Winter becomes very important for escapes because often the nights are longer, you can travel farther. And the door I'm standing at here most likely is the door where most freedom seekers entered when they came to the house. They wouldn't have come to a front door, they would have come to the back door. There used to be a side street here. There's several stories, many stories, that Levi gives us of freedom seekers, several of them that addresses what those arrivals were like. And Levi says there was not a night too late or a morning too early, where when that knock came on the door, Catherine, his wife, would be there to answer when the knock came. There's a story from a Quaker family in Richmond, just south of here, by the name of Bond, that is passed down in their family that actually talks about bringing a group of freedom seekers on Christmas night in 1844 here to the kitchen door. So in that story, it kind of leads us to believe that's probably how most of these arrivals happened. Now, Catherine is going to be, Levi's wife, the one responsible for freedom seekers while they're here. And as I said, she normally just has a day or two with most. It was important to keep freedom seekers moving. And we'll talk more about that when we go upstairs, why that's important. In one particular story that Levi gives in his book, he mentions the arrival of a young mother with two girls and having the girls sleep here along the fireside. He talks about just rolling out mattresses, sleeping here on the floor near the fire. But Levi also says in the 1840s, while living in this house, it wasn't unusual for them to be helping as many as 10 or more freedom seekers at one time. Levi's wife, Catherine, could not always be sure when these arrivals would happen, how many are going to come. In another story, Levi tells of Catherine answering the door very early in the morning while it's still dark. We can imagine that happening right here. She opens the door, and outside by the house, she sees two wagons. She doesn't see anybody in the wagons, but she asks the gentleman who knocked on the door, "What do you have there?" And her response, or his response, is, "I have all of Kentucky." So that's telling Catherine that not only does he have a group of freedom seekers, it sounds like he has a fairly large group. So her response is, "Bring Kentucky in." So Catherine can never be sure how many are coming. Are we just talking about men or women, children involved in these escapes? That did happen. And Levi said a little later in the morning when he woke and dressed, he came downstairs and found that Catherine was feeding 17 individuals. So how can you be prepared to feed that many people? How can you really be sure you can provide what is needed? Well, it helps that her husband owns the grocery store in town. So if she doesn't have enough in the house, all she had to do was walk down the street, get what was needed out of the store. A lot of his profits from the store went to buying those extra supplies so that when these moments happened, they were ready for that. So this room really becomes an important part of the functioning of the household. But unlike the two young girls that we have the story of sleeping here downstairs by the fireside, we're sure they didn't have 17 people sleeping here. So in a moment, when we go upstairs, I'll talk you through some scenarios of other parts of the house and how it may have been used. But we're going to go upstairs. I'm going up the back stairwell here in the house into what we call the servant girls room. Now, Levi says from time to time, they did have a live-in servant helping here in the house, most likely a young Quaker girl that lived here in the community that they trusted to not only know what they were doing, but who they were helping. Now, I want to get into a little bit of the legal situation the Coffins could find themselves in. What if they can get in trouble? There are laws that say what would happen if you're caught aiding and abetting a runaway slave. So those fugitive slave laws that I talked about, there were several versions. The earliest version passed in 1793. Another version will pass in 1850. But in that first version that says that if a slave escapes, no matter where they escape to, in the United States or its territories, those enslaved individuals can be captured, arrested, and sent back to slavery. But one of the weaknesses with that version of the law is it didn't say who was responsible for enforcing it. The assumption by our Congress in Washington is that Americans will just do their duty. If they run into someone that they know is a runaway slave, they'll turn them in. But as I said downstairs, there are people resisting that. And the Coffins were part of that effort. So in 1850, a new version of the law is going to pass. But in that original law, if you were caught aiding and abetting someone, you could be fined up to $500, which doesn't seem like a ton of money. But in today's money with inflation, we're talking closer to $20,000, $25,000. So there are a lot of Americans that couldn't afford that fine. And it does keep some people from helping. Now, as a result, because of the fact that there's no real enforcement for this law, slave owners decide to take things in their own hands. And so their response is to hire what were called bounty hunters or slave catchers. And these slave catchers are private individuals that are hired to go places to north into places like Indiana to try to find these runaways. So the Coffins had to be prepared in case these individuals showed up in town, but legally they could not search anyone's private property. A white individual, by the way, this was not so for Black property owners, but for white property owners like Levi Coffin, they couldn't just kick down his door because they assumed he may be hiding someone. In one particular story, Levi talks about hiding two young girls, or not Levi, excuse me. Levi says his wife, let me correct myself, hid two girls together in the same bed between the mattresses, not actually stuffed in the mattress, but between two mattresses. He's not specific where in the house, but it's possible it was in this back bedroom. It's the furthest from the front door. It seems that Catherine used the bed as a hiding spot. There's a story later in his book where Levi and Catherine had a reunion with a freedom seeker that they helped, and he recounted, "Don't you remember when you hid me in the bed?" And so he's remembering being hidden. How often did they have to hide people? We don't know. But in this particular story, Levi speaks to Catherine hiding two young girls because there are men looking for them. They almost caught them the day before at a community north of here in Randolph County, Indiana. And Levi says they were brought to his house because it was believed that it would be safer. Now, if these men arrive at the door, they can ask questions. But the only way they can actually do a search of the house is if they get a hold of what's called a search warrant, which is a legal document that you have to get from a judge. And a judge, if they do their due diligence, is going to ask for evidence. How do you know Levi Coffin is hiding someone in their home? And so we'll come back to that here in a moment. Levi claims his house was never searched, so it's possible that nobody was able to get a search warrant to search his home. Levi says the girls that were hidden in his bed, Catherine tells them to be quiet, to stay still, but they have a problem. They won't stop giggling. So if these men looking for them happen to get into the house, they come into this bedroom, assuming that this is where they were hidden. If they hear the bed laughing, they're going to find the girls right away. So Catherine had to divide the girls, hid them in two different beds, hoping that would get them to calm down. But we don't know how long they were hidden for. We know they had to stay with the Coffins for a good while, but we're not quite sure how long they were actually hidden. In another story, Levi talks about hiding a large group, a group of 14, in what he calls the garret. And there's a couple places here in the house that Levi would call the garret, which includes this space here with this small door. So I am going to open the door to try to give you a sense of this space. I'm not going to go inside. It's so dark, you won't see anything. But this door is only about 3 feet high. If I was to go in there, I would have to actually crawl on my hands and knees. Now, this space goes the entire length of this room. So in this story, he speaks of hiding a group of 14 who had escaped out of Kentucky. They had been hotly pursued from the first time that their escape. It was noticed right away that they had gone missing. And by the time that they had arrived here, we don't know again how long they spent time in the garret, but Levi says they were hidden in the garret until their pursuers had passed through town. So that's all much of, he doesn't give as many details in this story as he does with the girls hidden in the 2 beds. Now, how can we be sure that this is the space? We do try to research and try to find other pieces of evidence. A lot of people here in town knew the Coffins, respected them. Some of them were even family. And a nephew of his, a man named John Wright Johnson, as an older individual, not only claimed that this was the specific space that his uncle hid the 14 in his book, he actually talks about Levi hiding it by pushing furniture in front of it. Because if someone was able to search the house, they're going to look inside that door. So we assume it probably was a bed because of the size of the door and the wall. There's not a lot of pieces of furniture that you can use to hide it. And a bed would work. You could quickly push it in front. And then hopefully if someone was to search the house, they would know that there was a door there. Again, we don't know how long they were hidden for. He just said long enough until their pursuers passed through town. Levi believed that most of the individuals that he helped here during his 20 years in Indiana had found safety further north of here, most likely in Canada. He went to Canada twice. We're in one of the master bedroom, but I just want to note that Levi went twice and Catherine went once with him to Canada. He actually had reunions with some of the freedom seekers they helped. They were concerned to make sure that they were experiencing the life of freedom and hope that they had wanted to find by going north. And we're grateful to see that many of those individuals were doing well. They're able to attain educations, they become property owners, business owners, church leaders. So this particular room most likely was Levi and Catherine's room. Not really a lot of stories that I can connect to this space, other than I want to show that the Coffins were raising a family in the midst of all this activity. So on top of managing businesses, on top of Catherine managing the household, they were raising children as well. And unfortunately, though the children would be a great resource in understanding some of the stories a little further and a little deeper in what I'm telling you, unfortunately, none of those children left us any stories that we can use to help expand in our interpretation. So real quick, I just want to show, this is a stairway leading up to another space that Coffin would call the garret. We call it the attic. Again, I won't take you up there. The stairs are very steep, but it's a fairly large space. So when I talked about those 17 probably not sleeping downstairs, this may have been a space utilized for those periods when there were a lot of freedom seekers here. It may not be the most comfortable, especially in the summer or in the coldest winter days, but it's really the only other space available, because here on the second floor, the bedrooms would have been more filled with family members. Levi's mother lived with them for many years while they were here in the house, for part of the years, I should say, while they were here, and including their children. Now, Levi does go into the fact that there are some freedom seekers that arrive here who are not healthy, especially for those that tried to escape in winter. Exposure or frostbite, as we say today, was something that the Coffins encountered fairly often. And Catherine would have been seen as the doctor for the family. But we were very lucky here within the town that we actually had a doctor. His name was Dr. Henry Way. And Dr. Way would be summoned at times to help with the physical needs, the medical attention that some freedom seekers needed. In one story, Levi talks about 2 men who had escaped Kentucky, and even though that they were well dressed for the elements, their feet, they had boots on, the winter was so extreme that by the time they arrived here, their boots were frozen to their feet. And Levi says if they encountered someone that had a medical need, where traveling really isn't the best for them at that time to keep them moving, as long as they didn't get any indication that someone's looking for them, they would allow them to stay with the Coffins until they had recovered. And in this particular story, Levi says that they stayed with them until the spring months, which could mean they were here for maybe, 2 months, maybe a little longer, until they felt healthy enough that they could resume their journey. So I am going to head downstairs. There is one more part of the house that we're going to see. Hopefully I'm not giving anybody motions and I'm not moving too fast, but we have another tour that's going to start here in the house in 1:30. So I want to make sure I'm not in their way. So here back in the kitchen, there's a door that opens and leads into a basement space. Now I'm going to go down, but I'm not going to go all the way in because I do lose my cell signal if I go too deep into the kitchen. And Mr. Thomas, let me know if you see any lag, but I think I've gotten this down to where I don't have that problem so much anymore. But I want to be clear that in the space I'm going into, we don't have any specific stories from Levi's autobiography or from any other source that talks about this specific space in the house. So just know that everything I've given you up to this point, I can document, but everything I'm going to tell you from here on, I cannot. And that's the challenge sometimes when it comes to trying to learn about the Underground Railroad, really trying to understand who was involved, because most individuals as part of the Underground Railroad would not have documented what they were doing. If you're breaking the law, the last thing you want to do is keep a record of what you're doing and who you're helping, because that record could be used as evidence if someone was ever to accuse you for harboring and helping freedom seekers. Now, it's possible that when Coffin decided to build this house, again, this was built 13 years after they had arrived in town, he may have started seeing a pattern. With some of the quotes that he gives us in his book, when he talks about it's not unusual for us to have 10 or more freedom seekers in the house at one time. It's not by the 1840s. He talks about a greater presence of slave catchers, of seeing Newport, which is a historic name for our town, as being seen as a hotbed of abolitionism. And if you look at those two statements, it's possible that Levi is starting to see a pattern. And that pattern is the number of people they are helping is increasing. The number at one time, and maybe he says not a weak presence of people. So if they're seeing an increase in that, they're probably seeing an increase in the number of slave catchers looking for them. So when Coffin built this house, he may have created a basement area that I'm showing you here in response to providing a more safe and secure environment with many of these individuals arriving at night. Levi says the first thing his wife would do is to strike the fire and start cooking a meal. And if she was doing that in the upstairs kitchen, which we saw before, that could seem a little weird if they were doing that a lot, because people aren't supposed to be awake those times a day. But down here, where we have another fireplace that we know was being used for cooking, it is possible this is where that group of 17, for instance, were brought. And then when Levi came, when he woke to see how many had arrived, this probably was the space he may have seen them in. Again, I can't prove that. Levi never discusses what this space is. He never tells us why he built the house like this. But he spent an extreme amount of money to build this house with what we would call a finished basement, right down to adding a brick floor, which shows us this is not a space used every so often, maybe on a hot summer day, but it's being used more often. We'll probably never be able to prove it. Even the people that knew them well, who are some of our other sources, they never talk about this space. Now, there's something else down here that is also extremely unusual. And I want to go back to those slave catchers. If they wanted a search warrant, if they went to the judge here in Wayne County and said, that Levi Coffin, I know he is harboring fugitive slaves, help me catch this guy by giving me a search warrant. If the judge, again, is doing their due diligence in following the law, they would ask for evidence. What's your evidence to know what Levi Coffin is doing? And that evidence could be some of the things that they've observed about the household. And Levi says, I know sometimes these slave catchers are watching my house. So what are some of the things that they could look for? Well, are people going out and using an outhouse? How much water are they drawing? Those kinds of things. And they could use that potentially as evidence. So the reason I bring that up is because here in a small chamber to the side, there's a door. I'm going to do this very carefully. I can't go all the way in, but hopefully you can all see what looks like a hole in the brick. And if I could take you all the way down, I would show you that that hole is full of water. It is a well. And if there's anything that is extremely unusual about a house in this period of history, it is that you don't have an indoor well. Your water source would be outside. And it still works today. I could go down there and draw water out. So when the zombie apocalypse happens, this is where you're going to find me. I'm going to be a continual source of water. So what that helps to show us is we think Levi had a plan. The plan is to use the basement space, again, to provide a more secure location for when freedom seekers arrived, to feed them, to maybe store their supplies, but also to have access to that fresh water. So I'm gonna walk upstairs. Mr. Thomas, would you like me to go out to the barn? Which I can do.
Yes, I think that would be,
Okay.
that'd be wonderful, especially the false bottomed wagon. We watched Harriet Tubman a couple of weeks ago,
Okay.
and of course they had one of those in there as well.
All right, so just give me a moment. So safety and security is an extremely important thing to have a successful Underground Railroad effort. And this is something that Coffin learned about, I'm sure, when he was growing up in North Carolina. That's where he has his experience of slavery. And at the young age of 7, he says, I had deemed myself an abolitionist after he had learned what slavery was, and that slaves could actually be, at any moment's notice, separated from their families. And so he drew that empathy from a story he heard a slave tell his father. So while he was growing up in North Carolina, whenever he encountered someone who needed help, he was helping. And by the time he was a teenager, a young adult, he was actually physically helping in the movement of individuals. And so some of those things that he had learned in North Carolina, he and some of the other Quakers he knew well were using the same tactics. So I am in the barn behind the house that we were just in. Now I want to explain what we have in front of us. Levi, I mentioned, was a businessman. He owned the grocery store. He would have needed a wagon, such as what you see here. This is not Levi's wagon specifically, but it gives you the sense of the type of wagon he could have had. He used his wagon to go to Cincinnati a lot because that's where he would buy goods at wholesale and then bring them back to his store here in Fountain City and then resell it to the locals that lived near the store. But in order to safely move freedom seekers and to move them as quickly as possible, you have 2 options. You do it on foot or you use horsepower. And when I talked about the arrival of those 17, this is how they arrived. They arrived in wagons that were transitioned into what Levi would call a false bottom wagon. So I'm going to explain how this could work. If you see here, we have these ledges that are holding these boards. And someone could crawl under, or a small group of people can crawl under those boards, and on top of the boards and through the rest of the wagon, Levi or whoever's driving it would stack it full of something to give it the boxes of bottles, something like that. So the hope is, obviously, when I talked about those laws and talking about the fact that a person of color could be stopped at any point, at any time, even on the roadside, and question whether or not they were a free or slave person. This is the type of scenario they're trying to keep from happening. And especially if you're traveling with a large group, again, that 17, it just arouses suspicion in certain communities that don't like the Underground Railroad. So by using these false bottom wagons, they could hide individuals and hopefully get them 20, maybe up to 30 miles in a leg if needed. When Levi talks about using his wagon in some of the locations he went to, we could be there in less than 30 minutes in a vehicle. But remember, this is horsepower and that took longer. We're not going to have trains in this area for a long time. But again, they call it a railroad. That's kind of a way of describing how this system works. It kind of works like a train, where a train pulls into a station, it leaves people, it picks up a new group of people, it keeps moving, and it's got to stay on time. Well, this is sort of operating in the same sense. Wagons like this could arrive at the Coffin home. They're letting people go. Maybe they're going to take another group of people who are already there. They're going to take them further north into the next safe house or the next station. And the idea, again, is to keep the train moving so that slave catchers don't have the ability to catch up. Now, it happens sometimes it didn't. But in Levi's Reminiscences, that's the name of his book, he claims that none of the individuals he helped were ever caught. So that is the quick version without getting into too much detail. But I didn't know if you wanted me to take a question or two, or is there something, Mr. Thomas, you would like me to highlight that I didn't do at this point?
You did an amazing job in record time. I'm going to be quiet, and if my colleagues have students with questions, please come off mute and ask Ms. Hahn, Mrs. Hahn, about the tell them what the question is.
I'll go have a seat at the arbor since it's such a lovely day and answer questions.
How many people total passed through the Coffin home?
So basically what he tells us through his book is in the 20 years he lived in Indiana, he believed he estimated around 100 people were helped through his home. Now, again, he lived in a different location the first 13 years. The house technically still exists, but it's now part of the funeral home. It's not in its original location. Not a place that you can go visit and hear those stories. So in this particular house, if we go by that estimation, it could have been close to 1,000 individuals. But again, he's estimating this decades after when he's writing this book. However, I do want to note that doesn't include anyone he helped in North Carolina. And he's going to spend another 20 years about in Cincinnati doing this as well. So I think he thought around 1,000 in Cincinnati, and that doesn't count the work he's doing during the Civil War. So the impact he's made on lives is it's about the easiest way that we can put a number to it.
Would you share a little bit about Levi's trip to Canada?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. So Levi went twice. I'm trying to remember. The first one was in 1844, and I think the second one was 10 years later. I know it was in the mid 1850s, and his wife went with him. Again, as I mentioned, he was very curious of understanding what's at the end of this rail, like this effort, right? What does Canada look like? What are the opportunities? Are they really getting the chances and those opportunities that these individuals hope to find? He goes into some of the reunions that he and his wife had when they went in the 1850s. And one of the reunions they had was a woman named Eliza Harris. And I don't know if you talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. But Harriet Beecher Stowe, although it's a fiction book, she based many of the details off of real freedom seekers and their real escapes. And she had learned the story of Eliza Harris, I believe, from a man named John Rankin. But Levi talks about Eliza's escape, the real Eliza, but Harriet used that to create the character Eliza in her book. Eliza had escaped in February of 1838. She escaped with her young child. She barely survived an icy crossing of the Ohio River, trying to escape men. Sometimes the stories say they have dogs chasing her. We're not quite sure about that detail. She made it to the Ohio side, where she was met by supposedly a slave catcher. Other details say it was a Quaker. There's several different versions of the story. And she spent time with the Coffins for several days. And so that moment of the crossing of the Ohio River is what Harriet Beecher Stowe recreates for her character Eliza. It's almost word for word. But when Levi and Catherine went into Canada in the 1850s, they had arrived in a community known as Chatham, near the city of Detroit, Michigan. So if you cross into Canada, if you go to Detroit, that's one of the easy ways to cross into Canada between our two countries. And I believe they may have been at a church gathering. And a woman comes up to them, and Levi says, sometimes we didn't always recognize some of the individuals who recognized them right away, because you can imagine the number of faces and the short amount of time they spent with them, that they would remember certain details, but they may not remember their face. So I think Levi felt a little guilty that he didn't recognize Eliza right away. But anyway, she comes up and she calls them Uncle Levi, Aunt Katie, which was their nickname for many freedom seekers who knew them. And she goes, don't you remember me? My name is Eliza. You gave me my name. Now, the interesting detail with that is it shows us that maybe when freedom seekers were staying with the Coffins provided an alias name for them. And the reason they may have done that is Levi, as a practicing Quaker, very much consciously wanted to never lie about what he did. And so if he was ever questioned, let's say by a slave catchers, have you seen Jane Doe? We're looking for Jane Doe. He honestly could say, I don't know who you're talking about, because he didn't know the real names of the people that potentially that they met, if they provided an alias for them. And it seems that if that's what happened in Eliza's case, she adopted that name as her free name, is the way I look at it. So, so it's just one of several stories that Levi provides of that time in Canada, and I think also trying to, if something was needed, what could the Coffins do to help bring awareness to that? I think also is part of the reason for the trips. I can walk around the house here. Let me flip since I'm outside. Show you the other side of the house.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So when I was showing you the well room, or the where the well is located in the basement, it's actually underneath this porch right here.
Yep.
So I was standing under this porch when I was showing you that. I'll show you this bell right here. When I was talking about the two girls being hidden in the bed, Levi says in that story that if slave catchers came to the house, and let's say they tried to break in or tried to force their way in, Catherine was to ring a bell, because Levi's store was right down the street. So if he heard the bell, he would know something's going on. He needs to come home. So we sort of recreated. We don't know what the bell looked like. Was it a hand bell but this bell was donated to the site, and that's why we have a bell outside the house. Just to give you an idea of the barn, we just had a new roof installed on the barn, so it's nice and beautiful and bright. So show you our freedom walk real quick. Go ahead.
Yeah. Maybe next time they can see the 3-holer, but not this time.
Oh, well, I could do that. When children come and they get these tours, they're amazed to see how little privacy families had back then, including when it came to using the facilities. Now, I was just going to point out William Bush here on our Freedom Walk, who is another story that we interpret and tell, because he was a freedom seeker. And unlike most freedom seekers, he did not go on to Canada. He stayed here. There are several homes that he lived in that still stand here in town. He was a blacksmith, and he was involved in the Underground Railroad as well. So one of the things we're trying to do a little more of here at the site is to tell more of those type of stories. The Coffins didn't do this by themselves. The reason why the house is what it is today is because of Levi's book. He eventually did create a record of his life, and we're able to retell those stories. But I can walk up and down our highway here, US 27, and tell several more of other individuals like William Bush. So we're trying to expand on those stories and give people more of a outlook of what that was like for this town. It was really a town that supported this.
And thank you on very short notice, being willing to do this. How many tours have you had today?
We're getting ready to do our second. This is one of the few days we didn't have a school group visit. Starting next week, about every morning in May until about Memorial Day weekend, we will, till the end of the school year, we'll have school students here. So we do tours for the public, so people can just drive up on and ask for a tour. But if a school bus is here, we probably won't get you until the school bus leaves. But we're open year round, and we offer normally 3 tours a day for the public. And groups can book in advance, and like school groups, and come and visit us. So some days we do as many as 4 or 5.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that we very much appreciate your efforts. And I think that's all we have for right now.
All right. Well, again, if there's questions, if anybody thinks of something later, Mr. Thomas knows how to get a hold of me.
Thank you again.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.